The elderly woman packed her worn carpet bag in silence, moving through the ranch house like a ghost trying not to disturb the living. Ruth Campbell, 72, had been part of the Cameron Ranch for 3 years now. But tonight, something in her soul told her it was time to leave. She paused, looking over the kitchen she had come to know so well. Her hands trembled as she tucked a Bible, two faded dresses, and a tin photo frame, a picture of a young girl, into the bag. The girl had stopped writing years ago. Margaret, her daughter. Ruth could feel the weight of her absence like a stone pressing against her chest. The note she left on the kitchen table was simple. Thank you for your kindness. I won't be a burden anymore. But Ruth knew that was a lie. It wasn't about kindness. It was about pride. She couldn't face becoming a burden. She couldn't bear the thought of being a shadow in someone else's life. Earlier that day, the signs had been too clear. The coffee she tried to pour had spilled in her shaking hands. The heavy cast iron pot had slipped from her grasp, crashing loudly onto the floor. Jake, one of the young ranch hands, rushed to her side. "You okay, Mrs. Campbell?" he asked, his face full of concern. Ruth snapped at him before she could stop herself. "I can manage." The words sounded harsh, even to her own ears. The truth was, she didn't feel capable of managing anything anymore. Her memory had started to fail her. She burned biscuits, forgot the salt, and felt like the house was closing in around her. The young ones who worked on the ranch, they didn't see the years of hard labor in her bones. They just saw a woman who couldn't keep up. And soon, James Cameron, the ranch owner, would see it too. It was when she overheard a conversation between two ranch hands that it all became too much. "She's slowing down. Boss will have to make a decision soon," one said. The other responded, "She's a good woman, but ranches need workers who can work." Ruth felt a sharp pain in her chest. She was being let go. The thought of being cast aside, of being no more than a fading memory, stung deeper than she could bear. Her mind flashed back to a time when she had been cast out before. Her daughter Margaret, married to a man named Thomas Pritchard, had sent her away. Ruth had tried to protect Margaret from Thomas, but it was all for nothing. After intervening in one of his violent rages, Ruth had been blamed for causing trouble. Margaret chose her abusive husband over her own mother. Ruth had been alone ever since. She had arrived at Cameron Ranch 3 years ago with just $20 in her pocket and a heart broken by betrayal. But over time, the ranch had become a place of solace. James had never asked her to stay. He had just let her. He'd never questioned her decision to remain a stranger in his home. The ranch had been her refuge, but now it felt like a cage. And tonight, she had decided it was time to leave. At 2 in the morning, Ruth grabbed her carpet bag and made her way to the front door. The house was still. The wind howled outside, but inside there was only silence. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, taking one last look at the ranch. She hadn't intended to leave this way. She had hoped to slip away quietly, like the shadow she had become. But as her foot hit the porch step, the light in the hallway flickered on. James Cameron stood there, fully dressed, arms crossed over his chest. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Campbell?" he asked, his voice low, but full of the weight of someone who had seen too many good people try to leave. Ruth froze. The humiliation of being caught so off guard flooded over her. I have a cousin in Cheyenne," she lied, her voice trembling. She hadn't mentioned a cousin in 3 years of living at Cameron Ranch, but she was desperate for an excuse, desperate to cover up her shame. James raised an eyebrow. "You haven't mentioned a cousin in 3 years, he pointed out, his voice more curious than accusing. She couldn't lie anymore. Not to him, not to herself. I'm not what I used to be," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "I can't stay here, not like this." James studied her for a moment, then spoke softly but firmly. "In the middle of the night? In November? You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Campbell. Come to the kitchen. Coffee's on." Ruth looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was going to happen next. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going anywhere tonight. The kitchen was dimly lit by a single lamp as Ruth sat at the worn wooden table, the hours creeping by in the deep silence that filled the house. James poured coffee into two mismatched cups, the steam rising in the cold air of the early morning. Neither of them spoke at first, the silence thick with unsaid things. Outside, the owl called in the distance, and the wind howled against the house, but inside, it was a different kind of storm that seemed to settle between them. The kitchen felt colder than it should have, as if it were a place where the warmth of conversation had long since been extinguished. Ruth's hands were still shaking slightly, the aftermath of the night's hurried packing and the sudden confrontation. She had spent the last few hours trying to convince herself that she had made the right choice. But now, as she sat across from James, she realized that leaving was never the answer. James, however, wasn't going to let her retreat back into the silence. Not this time. "My wife died 5 years ago, come January," he said quietly, breaking the silence with an honesty that felt like a sharp breath of cold air. Ruth nodded, knowing the truth, but unsure of how to respond. She had seen in the way he carried himself, in the way he had withdrawn after Sarah's death. She had seen it when he buried his sorrow in work, when he sent his daughter Emma away to boarding school to escape the ghost of the ranch, but she had never heard him speak about it. Not like this. "I know. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes lost in thought. There was something else hanging in the air between them, something Ruth had never fully known until now. "You came here to escape something, didn't you?" James asked, his voice gentle but probing. Ruth's throat tightened, and she looked down at the table, unable to look him in the eye. The truth was something she had kept buried for far too long. It was too painful to face, but as she sat there with James, it felt like the walls were closing in on her, forcing her to finally tell her story. "I came here with nothing," she began, her voice trembling, as if the words had been waiting for years to be spoken. "I had $20 in my pocket and a heart full of hurt. I thought I'd be able to make a fresh start, but it's never that easy." She paused, taking a breath, feeling the weight of the memory pressing down on her. "Margaret, my daughter, she was married to a man named Thomas Pritchard. At first, he was charming kind, but after they were married, he changed. He became violent. I tried to help her. I tried to protect her, but I only made things worse. The day I left, he hit me. He struck me so hard that I bled. I thought he was going to kill me, and Margaret, she blamed me. She said I provoked him. She turned against me, and I was left with nothing." The words came out in a rush, and Ruth stopped, her chest tight with the weight of the truth. She hadn't told anyone this, not even the ranch hands who had seen her come here with a broken heart. They had seen the quiet woman who baked bread and sang hymns. They hadn't seen the woman who had been cast aside by her own flesh and blood. James listened quietly, his eyes steady on her, his expression softening with each word she spoke. "You didn't fail her," he said, his voice low but firm. "She failed you." Ruth shook her head, the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I should have known. I should have done more. I shouldn't have let him get away with it," she said, her voice shaking with guilt. But James wouldn't let her continue down that path. "You were her mother. You did what you could," he said, his tone stronger now. "What happened between you two wasn't your fault. You can't carry that weight any longer." Ruth sat silently, trying to absorb his words, but the guilt was still there, gnawing at her insides. She had left her daughter, and she hadn't been there when Margaret needed her the most. But even as she sat there, her heart heavy with the weight of her past, Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of understanding. She had spent so much time blaming herself for things she couldn't change that she had forgotten to forgive herself. James's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up, surprised. "You came here for a reason, Ruth," he said softly. "I hired you because I saw something in you. You were broken, just like me, but you brought something to this place. You brought life back into this house when I thought it was gone for good." Ruth blinked in surprise, her throat tightening. She hadn't expected him to say that. She hadn't expected him to see her. I, I didn't do anything special," she murmured, her eyes lowering. But James wouldn't let her off the hook so easily. "You didn't try to replace Sarah. You were here. You sang. You cooked. You gave Emma something I couldn't give her. A grandmother. You gave me someone to talk to when I couldn't bear to speak about Sarah anymore." Ruth felt the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her, a glimmer of peace. "You've been a part of this family for years, Ruth," James continued, his voice softening. "You've done more than just work here. You've been family." Ruth stared at him, the words sinking in. She had been afraid that she was just a worker, just someone they tolerated out of kindness. But James saw her for who she really was, someone who had been broken, but who had still found a way to give love and care. And maybe, just maybe, she was more than just a burden. Ruth took a shaky breath and looked at James, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was a burden," she confessed, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "I thought that when I stopped being useful, I'd have to leave. But I don't want to be a burden. I want to be someone who matters." James nodded, his gaze steady. "You matter. You've always mattered." Ruth felt the words settle in her heart, and for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. But the truth wasn't done yet. There was more to come. As the night stretched on and the first light of dawn began to break, James spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. "There's something else you need to know, Ruth. You didn't hear the whole conversation yesterday. The ranch hands, they weren't talking about letting you go. They were talking about how they could help you." Ruth frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. James smiled softly. "They care about you, Ruth. They've been worried about you. They were talking about finding help for you, not replacing you." Ruth sat back, stunned. The realization hit her hard. All this time, she had thought they saw her as nothing more than a burden. But in truth, they saw her as the heart of the ranch. They saw her as family. The truth had been waiting for her to recognize it. And now, as she sat there in the quiet kitchen with James, she finally understood. The ranch wasn't just a place where she worked. It was home, and she had a place in it. But it wasn't just about the ranch. It was about family. And as long as she had family, she would never be a burden again. Dawn was breaking outside, and Ruth looked at James, her heart full of gratitude. "I want to stay," she said, her voice strong. "I want to stay, but not as the cook. I want to stay as family." James smiled, his eyes warm. "Then stay, Ruth. Stay." And with that, the door was finally open for Ruth to see her place in the world. But there was one more thing James had to show her, something that would change everything. He motioned for her to follow him, and as they stood to leave the kitchen, Ruth felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Whatever came next, she knew it would be a new beginning. "There's something you need to see," James said, and Ruth followed him, ready to face whatever came next. Ruth felt her breath catch as the weight of James's words settled deep in her chest. But the hardest part was yet to come. She had agreed to stay, but there was a deeper fear gnawing at her insides. A fear that had been growing ever since she had walked into the ranch 3 years ago. A fear that one day she would be seen as nothing more than a fading memory, someone who had overstayed her welcome. It was a fear she had carried with her from Denver, from the moment her daughter Margaret had cast her out of their lives. That day, the day she had been blamed for Margaret's suffering, had left a scar that Ruth could never erase. She had spent the years since trying to fill the void, trying to find a place where she could make a difference. But deep down, she feared that she was still that unwanted woman, doomed to always be the one who gave, but never received. Ruth's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. It was Cora, the young woman James had hired to help around the ranch. She was standing there, looking hesitant, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "You wanted me to check on the pantry, Mrs. Campbell," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Ruth glanced at her, feeling a flicker of recognition in the young woman's timid demeanor. Cora was like a mirror, reflecting the same uncertainty Ruth had felt when she had first arrived at the ranch. A woman who had lost everything and was now searching for a place to belong. Ruth gave her a small smile, though it felt like a crack in the facade she had carefully constructed over the years. "Of course, Cora," she said, her voice still shaky, but her words laced with a tenderness she hadn't expected. "Let me show you where the flour is. We're baking tomorrow for Thanksgiving." Cora's face brightened at the mention of Thanksgiving, but Ruth could see the quiet desperation in her eyes, the same quiet that Ruth had once known so well. She was the same age Ruth had been when she had left her daughter, a time when Ruth had believed she could start over, that she could leave behind the heartbreak and the loss. But life, as it always did, had a way of catching up. I've never baked anything like this before," Cora admitted, her voice shaky. Ruth chuckled softly, the sound of it foreign to her own ears. "It's easier than you think," Ruth said, her hands already moving toward the flour bin. She began measuring it out, her motions practiced, a rhythm she had known for years. Cora watched her, her eyes soft with curiosity, and Ruth couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one who had something to offer. Maybe there was something she could still teach, even after everything she had been through. As Ruth began to mix the ingredients for the pie crusts, the door creaked open again. This time, it was James, his face serious, his eyes dark with something Ruth couldn't quite place. "I got a letter from Emma," he said, holding out the envelope to Ruth. "She wrote it last week, before I sent her back to school." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected a letter from Emma. Not so soon. Not after all the time they had been apart. She took the envelope from James's hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The paper was worn, the handwriting neat but formal, the way a young girl might write when she wanted to be polite but wasn't sure what to say. "Dear Mrs. Campbell," Ruth began, her voice low as she read aloud. "I miss your cinnamon rolls. I miss hearing you sing while you bake. The other girls at school have grandmothers who visit them, and I tell them about you. I hope you're doing well and that you're not lonely. Will you teach me to make Mama's apple pie when I come home for Christmas? I want to remember her through your hands." Ruth's eyes blurred with tears as she read the final line, and her voice faltered. She hadn't realized how much Emma missed her, how much she had become a part of the young girl's life. Ruth had never been a grandmother to anyone, not until Emma, and now she could see that her presence had meant more than she had ever known. The words felt like a balm to her wounded heart, like a piece of the puzzle falling into place. James watched her closely as she finished reading the letter, his expression unreadable. Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still in disbelief at the depth of Emma's affection. She had always thought of herself as a shadow in their lives, a temporary fixture who would eventually fade away. But Emma's letter had changed that. Ruth wasn't just someone who had helped bake pies or sing hymns. She had become a part of Emma's memories, a piece of Sarah that she could hold on to. "She wants to learn how to make the pie," Ruth said softly, her voice full of emotion. "She wants to remember her mother through my hands." James smiled gently, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "She loves you, Ruth," he said simply, his voice full of warmth. Ruth's heart swelled with a tenderness she hadn't known was possible. For so long, she had been afraid that she would be forgotten, that the love she had given would never be enough. But Emma's letter, Emma's words, they had shown her that love wasn't just about being perfect or doing everything right. Love was about presence, about being there when someone needed you most. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she thought about the way Emma had looked up to her, the way she had relied on Ruth for comfort and guidance. Ruth had spent so many years hiding from her own mistakes, running from the things that had broken her. But now, in the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by the scent of baking pies and the soft laughter of Cora, Ruth realized that she wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned by her daughter. She wasn't just a woman who had failed. She was Emma's grandmother, and that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "I'll teach her," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady now. "I'll teach her to make the pie, and I'll be there for her, just like I promised." James nodded, his eyes soft with pride. "You already are, Ruth. You always have been." As Ruth looked at the letter in her hands, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was someone who mattered. And for the first time in years, Ruth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. The rest of the night passed in a blur of preparations. Ruth and Cora worked side by side, preparing for the Thanksgiving feast. The kitchen was alive with activity, pies in the oven, bread rising, and the familiar scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. Ruth could hear the ranch hands out in the barn, their voices drifting through the windows, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The past was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but she had learned something important that night. She had learned that family wasn't just something you were born into. It was something you built one moment at a time. And as she looked around at the people who had come to mean so much to her, Ruth realized that she was no longer alone. She had a family again, and this time, she wasn't going anywhere. Ruth woke early the next morning, the cold air creeping into the room as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with everything that had happened the night before. The conversation with James, the letter from Emma, the realization that she wasn't just someone who worked in the kitchen, but a part of something much bigger, a part of family. As she moved through the house, preparing the breakfast for the ranch hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed overnight. The house, which had once felt so empty, now seemed full of promise. She had always been afraid of becoming a burden, of being the one people tolerated out of kindness rather than necessity. But now, as she looked at the ranch, at the land she had helped tend, and the people she had come to care for, she realized she had a place here, a real place. The kind of place she had been searching for her entire life. As she laid the biscuits out on the counter, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. It was James, looking more tired than usual, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Ruth, I wanted to talk to you about Emma." His voice was heavy with something, but Ruth couldn't quite place it. She turned to face him, setting down the biscuit tray. "What about her?" she asked, feeling a strange sense of dread settle in her stomach. "She'll be here tomorrow," James said quietly. "I know she's been excited about coming home for Christmas, but—" He trailed off, his eyes searching hers for some kind of understanding. Ruth waited, heart pounding her chest. "But what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been asking about you," James said, his gaze shifting to the floor. "She's been worried about you, Ruth. She thought you were going to leave." Ruth's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She had thought about leaving many times, but to hear that Emma had been worried about her, that she had been upset by the idea of Ruth leaving, well, that was something Ruth hadn't been prepared for. The weight of her daughter's letter, of Emma's words, settled over her like a heavy blanket, smothering the breath from her lungs. She hadn't realized how much Emma had relied on her, how much she had come to depend on Ruth being there for her. And now, Ruth realized she had no choice but to stay. "I didn't want to be a burden to you," Ruth said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "I didn't want to be someone who wore out their welcome, who stayed too long." James stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You're not a burden, Ruth. You're family. You're not here because you have to be. You're here because you're needed. And Emma needs you." Ruth's heart swelled with emotion, but the knot in her throat tightened. "I never thought she'd need me. I thought she had you. I thought I was just a shadow in your life." James shook his head. "You've been more than that. You've been the one who held this place together when I couldn't. You've been the one who gave Emma a sense of stability, a sense of comfort. You've been the one who made this house feel like a home again." Ruth's eyes filled with tears as the full weight of his words washed over her. She had always thought of herself as someone who was just passing through, but in that moment, she realized she had been wrong. She wasn't just passing through. She was a part of something, a part of this family. And maybe, just maybe, she had always been meant to be here. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not turning me away when I thought I had nothing left to give." James smiled, his eyes soft with affection. "You've given more than you'll ever know." As they stood in the kitchen together, the sound of the ranch hands outside growing louder as they began their morning chores, Ruth felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She wasn't just someone who had been left behind. She was family. And tomorrow, when Emma arrived, she would be there to welcome her, to show her that she was no longer alone, that she had a place in this world. Ruth didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she was ready to face it. She was ready to stay. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden glow across the land as Ruth stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The ranch was alive with activity, and as she watched the men working in the fields, she felt a deep sense of connection to everything around her. This was her home. This was where she belonged, and she wasn't going anywhere. Later that day, Ruth and James made their way to the train station to pick up Emma. Ruth had been nervous, a fluttering anxiety in her chest as she thought about how she would be received. She had missed Emma so much, more than she had realized. The last time she had seen her, Emma had been so young, so full of hope and innocence. Now, she was growing up, and Ruth couldn't help but feel the weight of that distance between them. The train pulled into the station, and Ruth's heart skipped a beat as she saw Emma standing there, her eyes scanning the crowd for her father. Ruth stepped forward, her heart racing. Emma's eyes landed on her, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emma's face lit up with recognition, and before Ruth could say a word, Emma was running toward her, throwing her arms around Ruth in a tight embrace. "Mrs. Campbell, you came," Emma exclaimed, her voice full of joy. Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she held Emma close, feeling the warmth of her embrace. "Of course I came, sweetheart," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Ruth felt whole. She had been afraid that she would never be enough, that she would always be the one who was left behind. But now, as she held Emma in her arms, she knew that she had found her place. This was her family, and they needed her as much as she needed them. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ruth felt ready to face it. Together, they would build something that would last. Together, they would be a family. The crisp air of the early morning did little to cool the heat that was rising inside Ruth. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable as she did now. The evening before had been filled with simple comforts, the warmth of being together, and the overwhelming realization that she had found something worth staying for. But today, standing in the middle of the kitchen with the promise of Emma's arrival looming on the horizon, Ruth was faced with the most difficult conversation of her life. James had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and Ruth, despite her fear, knew it was time to face the truth. Her past was still haunting her, and it wasn't just the mistakes she had made with her daughter Margaret. It was the lies she had told herself, the belief that she wasn't worthy of love or belonging. She had spent too many years convinced that she was nothing more than a burden, that she was someone who needed to be hidden away, not someone who could be celebrated and loved. Ruth had never been a mother to anyone except Margaret, and even then, it had been a relationship full of bitterness and regret. She had tried to protect her daughter from the pain of an abusive marriage, but Margaret had blamed her, cast her aside when she needed her the most. Now, years later, Ruth was trying to reconcile with that truth. She had buried it for so long, hidden it away like a dark secret, but now it was all coming to light. James had offered her a place in his life, in his home, in his family, but Ruth wasn't sure she deserved it. Could she really be a mother again? Could she be the kind of mother Emma needed, the kind of mother Sarah had been to her? These questions gnawed at Ruth's insides, and the weight of them was almost unbearable. James was standing in the doorway, watching her with quiet intensity, but Ruth couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She knew he was waiting for her to speak, to make the next move, but the words were stuck in her throat. "Ruth," James said gently, stepping into the room, his voice low but steady. "I don't know how to say this, but I need you to understand something." Ruth finally met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he spoke. "I've never told you this before, but when Sarah died, I didn't know how to be a father anymore." The words hung in the air between them, and Ruth felt her heart sink. She had known about Sarah's death, had known about the grief that had swallowed James whole, but hearing him say it out loud was something different. "I know you were both grieving," Ruth said quietly, unsure of what to say. "But I was still here, Ruth. I was still here, and I couldn't bring myself to be the father Emma needed. I thought I could keep going, that if I just kept working, kept pretending everything was fine, I'd eventually figure it out. But I didn't. I couldn't." Ruth's chest tightened as she listened to his confession. She could hear the pain in his voice, the guilt that had been eating away at him for years. It wasn't just about Sarah's death. It was about everything. The way he had retreated from life, the way he had sent Emma away to boarding school, the way he had let the ranch become a place of isolation rather than a home. "I should have been there for Emma," James continued, his voice breaking. "I should have known she needed me, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't see her hurting because I was too busy hurting myself." Ruth could feel the tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to him. She knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel as though you had failed the people you loved. She had spent years believing that she had failed Margaret, that she had failed as a mother, and that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough. But listening to James now, hearing the weight of his guilt, made her realize something important. He was just as broken as she was, and they both had the chance to heal, to find a way forward together. "You're not alone in this, James," Ruth said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You never were." James looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "And you're not alone either, Ruth," he said quietly. "You don't have to carry that burden by yourself. You're a part of this family now. You always have been." Ruth shook her head, unable to accept his words. "I've always been afraid of being a burden," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to be the one who stayed too long, who took too much, who wore out her welcome. I've been running from that my entire life." James stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "You've never been a burden to me, Ruth. You've been a lifeline. And Emma needs you. She needs you now more than ever." Ruth's heart swelled at the thought of Emma, at the way she had embraced her the day before, the way she had run to her with open arms. Ruth had never felt so needed, so valued. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Maybe she wasn't just someone who had been cast aside. Maybe she was someone who could still give, someone who could still love and be loved in return. "I'm scared, James," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared that I'll fail her, that I'll let her down like I did Margaret." James shook his head, his eyes filled with unwavering certainty. "You won't. You're already doing it, Ruth. You've already made a difference in Emma's life. You've given her something I couldn't give her, a connection to her mother. You've given her a piece of Sarah that no one else could." Ruth felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, not wanting to let herself be consumed by the emotions swirling inside her. "But I'm not her mother," Ruth said softly. "I'm not the one who gave birth to her." James's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to be. You're her grandmother, and that's enough." The words hung in the air between them, and Ruth felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in years, She allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't Margaret's replacement. She wasn't Sarah's shadow. She was Emma's grandmother, and that was enough. And when Emma came home, when she stepped off that train and into Ruth's arms, Ruth would be ready. She would be ready to be the mother, the grandmother, the woman who had always been there, even when she didn't know she was. "I'm ready, James," Ruth said, her voice steady now. "I'm ready to be the mother she needs. I'm ready to be her grandmother. I'm ready to be a part of this family." James smiled at her, his face soft with pride. "Then you already are." And in that moment, Ruth knew that she had found her place. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was a part of something real, something lasting. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere. Christmas Eve arrived, and the ranch was alive with excitement, bustling with the preparations for the holiday feast. The cold, crisp air outside only heightened the warmth inside the house, where the kitchen hummed with activity. Ruth, once hesitant about her place here, now moved through the house with a sense of purpose, her hands steady as she prepared the dishes that would soon fill the tables. The warmth of the hearth seemed to echo in her chest as she looked around, realizing how much this place had become her home. The quiet ache of loneliness that had once plagued her was gone, replaced by the laughter of the ranch hands and the soft chatter of Cora, who had quickly become like a daughter to her. Ruth found herself teaching Cora the small things, how to knead the dough just right, the secret to making the biscuits crisp on the outside and soft on the inside, and the perfect timing for a roast to come out of the oven. Cora, eager to learn, absorbed every word, and Ruth couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. The same house that had once felt cold and empty now thrived with life, filled with the warmth of new memories, of stories shared and meals made with care. The men were outside, chopping wood and securing the barn, preparing for the feast that would be held later that evening. And Ruth knew this would be the first Christmas in a long time that she would spend without the burden of shame weighing on her shoulders. James had asked her to say grace, a request that had caught her off guard. She had never been one to take center stage, especially when it came to matters of faith, but as she stood before the gathered ranch hands and Cora, with Emma by her side, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The words came easily, despite the tightness in her throat. "Thank you for second chances," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for the family we've found in each other, for the love that's been given and received, and for this home, which has become a place of belonging." She paused, the weight of her own words settling into her heart. "And for those who see us when we can't see ourselves." The prayer lingered in the air, a prayer of thanks not just for the meal before them, but for the family Ruth had found, a family she never thought she would have. After the meal, Ruth found herself outside, standing on the porch as the sun set in the distance. The sky was awash of oranges and pinks, and the stars were just beginning to peek through. It was cold, but Ruth didn't feel it. She felt a warmth in her chest, a deep peace she had never known before. James joined her on the porch, handing her a steaming mug of cider. "It's been a good day," he said, his voice calm and content. Ruth smiled, looking out at the ranch. "It has," she agreed, her heart full. "It really has." "Are you still afraid?" James asked, his gaze steady on her. Ruth paused, the question catching her off guard. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of not being enough, afraid of being cast aside. But as she stood there, surrounded by the life she had built, she realized the fear had faded. "No," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid anymore." "Good," James said with a small smile, his eyes warm with approval. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the ranch come alive in the glow of the fading sunlight. The next few days passed in a blur of holiday preparations. Emma had arrived, her eyes bright with excitement, and Ruth couldn't help but feel a swell of pride when Emma called her Grandma Ruth for the first time. It was a simple phrase, but it meant the world to Ruth. She wasn't just a woman who had come to the ranch looking for refuge. She was part of family now, and she had a place in this world. The week before Christmas, Emma had insisted that Ruth teach her how to make Sarah's apple pie. Ruth had smiled softly at the request, feeling the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. For the first time in years, she was able to pass down something that mattered, something that had been passed down to her. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of laughter and the scent of cinnamon and butter as Ruth guided Emma through the process, teaching her the secret to the perfect pie crust and the delicate balance of spices that made the filling just right. Ruth found herself telling Emma's stories of Sarah, how she had laughed with flour in her hair, how she had always known just when to add a little more sugar to the apples. As Ruth shared these memories, she felt a connection to Sarah that she hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah had been gone for years, but now, through the warmth of the kitchen and the joy of Emma's presence, it felt as though Sarah was still there, a part of the family Ruth had found. As Christmas Eve arrived, Ruth felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The house was full, the tables were set, and the fire crackled on the hearth. The ranch hands had gathered, and James's brother, Michael, had arrived from Texas, much to James's surprise. Michael had been skeptical of the idea of Ruth staying, but now, seeing the warmth in the house and the joy on everyone's faces, he couldn't help but smile. He leaned over to James as they prepared to sit down for dinner. "Is that," he started, nodding toward Ruth. James nodded with a smile. "Yeah, that's Mom." Michael grinned, clapping James on the back. "About damn time." Ruth, sitting at the head of the table, felt a deep sense of gratitude for the place she had found herself in. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She wasn't just someone who had been broken. She was the matriarch of this family, and she had earned her place here. As the night wore on, the warmth of the fire and the hum of conversation filled the air. Ruth found herself tucking Emma into bed later that night, the little girl's eyes heavy with sleep. "Grandma Ruth," Emma murmured, "will you tell me about Mama?" Ruth smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from Emma's face. "Every story I have, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice full of love. And as she began to tell Emma's stories of Sarah, of her laughter, her kindness, and the love she had given, Ruth felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Ruth stood by the window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. The world was quiet, still, but for the first time in years, Ruth felt a sense of belonging, a sense of home. She wasn't just a visitor in this life anymore. She was a part of it. The next morning, Christmas Day, arrived with the first light of dawn, and Ruth found herself standing in the kitchen once again, preparing the meal for the family. She was no longer a stranger, no longer someone who had come from the outside looking in. She was home, and it wasn't just the house or the land that made it so. It was the people. As Ruth looked around, her heart full, she knew that this was the family she had always dreamed of. It was everything she had ever wanted, and it was hers. This was her home, and she would never leave.